All right. I think maybe I will get started. Let me check the other room to make sure there's nobody hanging out there. It looks like it's just me. Um, we're about 12:23, so hopefully most of you are here. If you're in the watching alone group, you know, you can hang out there for now, but I'd recommend you find yourself a table to kind of sit with. Certainly during labs, you'll want to be doing that. But even right now, we're going to do something a little later that may, hopefully we'll get to something a little later that may help you out to be in a table as well. So, you don't have to, you don't have to be nice. Well, you have to be nice, but you don't actually have to do anything. So feel free just to log in there, and if you need to, even you can even join your own room. But there's no reason to watch alone. Wish I could see who is in the alone room. Could just be my my TAs and mentors. All right, so let's get started. There's nothing really here. As I started typing, I realized there was nothing of too much note in the housekeeping, but I like to get in the process of doing this just because eventually I'll need to tell you stuff. So one of the things I did send out on Discord was I sent out a little link to an exercise on an open versus proprietary software debate. We'll be looking at that. What I'll probably do, if time goes well and everything, fortune smiles on us, is I will probably give you a little bit of time at the end of class today to kind of look into some of the concepts, kind of look into the debate. And then on Friday, just before lab or at the start of lab, we'll take 20 to 30 minutes or so just to run a couple of debates. I have worked in both proprietary and open source software. I love open source software. I love proprietary software. You will not offend me by your positions. I can argue either side of it. Philosophically, I have had enough issues trying to keep things closed source or trying to keep things proprietary that as a pragmatist, I find that open source software is appealing because you don't have to waste a lot of time trying to protect your code from inadvertent release. So just from a pragmatic side, I find open source to be very appealing. And if you have the proper business plan, you can still become rich and famous and run a $4 billion company in Red Hat, for example. But that's not always the case, and it certainly doesn't match into a lot of the business mechanisms we have. And places like Apple are kind of hard to fight with. And if you think about if Apple hadn't been allowed to keep their stuff proprietary, would we have iPhones? Would they have had the incentive to put that much effort into them? So it's a two-way street. There are good arguments on both sides. So we will hopefully get into that a little bit, and hopefully you guys will come up with some cool arguments. The idea is to get you thinking. We hope that when you come out of this, you'll have a good appreciation for open source software. Maybe some of you will start up a company that uses open source software or manages open source software, either uses it in generating your own code, or maybe even maintains it or frees it, whatever you want to say. But you should be thinking about it. There are multiple ways of designing software. Part of what this class is about is getting you thinking in those alternate ways. I said this last time, office hours have again been published to the repository. We'll take a look at the repository in just a second. But a couple of them have changed. A few people who were doing it on WebEx are now doing it on Discord. I think Discord is probably the way most of us are going to go. Personally, I need to do it on WebEx because this is not my only course. So I need to have a place for my advisees and you guys and Arcos and other people to find me. So I will keep mine on WebEx for now, even though it's probably not as good as Discord or some of the other options. And if before you ask, I actually do have my recorder going, so we should be recording now. Hunter says, "Are we really better off with having iPhones as opposed to not having iPhones? Was that a worthwhile trade-off?" Here's an interesting thing. I'm not going to fight that trade-off, but they're cool. And I was just browsing some stuff, and there's a company out in California called, blanking on the name, but they're trying to kind of go past iPhones and past Google Glasses, and they are instrumenting contact lenses. So you can come up like the Terminator, the little responses can come up. Let's say you're in France and you don't speak French. I'll be back. Whatever. Je vais retourner or something like that. But it's just the coolest thing ever. And as a technophile, are we better off without iPhone or with iPhones? No opinion. Personally, I have a lot less fun, probably. Elon's trying his best. So there's actually, so speaking of, you guys we're never going to get through class today. Speaking of Neuralinks, there's actually a group in SUNY. They've talked to Arcos before. They've put out some collaborative stuff for us before that actually works with Neuralinks, trying to, for different things, for neuro interfaces to computer, for people with disabilities, physical therapy, moving stuff on the screen. It's just been it's really kind of a cool process, and I'll try to dig that up for you guys later maybe. And I think a lot of their stuff is also open source, so that's cool as well. All right. We have our first assignment coming up. I'll probably cue you in on it at lab this week. Maybe not until next week. It'll be due on. Well, let's kind of pop over there. It will be due on. So like most things, I can either see what I'm doing or interact with the screen. So here's our website, CSCI 4470 open source. We do have the schedule here. So if you go to resources, come down to the spring 2021 schedule. On the 26th of February, just before the end of the first third of the semester, give or take, we're going to have an open source project due. And before you get too worried about that, this is an analysis of an open source project. I think I'll have to check what I have as guidelines, but I think for last year or last time I taught this, I asked you to quickly go through 5 different projects and analyze them. The idea wasn't to pick best, pick worst. It was to look at the different characteristics and consider what you find, which ones you like, which ones you don't like, as an eye towards when you build your own open source project, or if you decide to join some open source project, to give you an idea of what to look for, how you can analyze it, what tools are available. And then do a little bit more of a deeper dive on a final one, or analyze 4 or analyze 5 and take a deep dive into one of those and tell us more about it. So that's coming up toward the end of February. We are sitting here on the 9th, so we're still pretty early in the semester. This will be your first, I think that's worth like 10% of your grade. So we will give you the opportunity to work on that for a week or two. I haven't decided whether I'll actually release it on the 19th or release it on the 12th. But either way, it's something that you should look forward. I'll either release it on the 19th or I'll release it on the 16th. It's not really there's not a lot of work there, but we are giving you tools now. And by the end of Tuesday the 16th, you'll actually have some information on licensing that you can use to kind of analyze it as well. All right. Onward and upward. We have 2 presentations today. The first is on documentation. Oh, are there any questions before we move on? Okay, so we have 2 presentations today. One is on documentation and one is on community involvement. And they kind of tie together. Well, they obviously tie together. Documentation is one of the ways that you can get involved with the community. I put the community involvement last because it actually has our little exercise. Maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't, but it's what we're going to do today. What we want to talk about with documentation, of course, first we want to go in and grab our Creative Commons license. What we want to talk about, and by the way, here's the reference material. There's a lot of reference material. I don't expect you all to memorize all of this. But if I were going into a test and it was an open book test, I'd probably want to have these things bookmarked or downloaded because it'll be a good reference for you. If we have our first test coming up on, let's say, 3.5, and you look at all the stuff that we've had before 3.5, you can see that I can give you some questions on Git. I can give you some questions on history and additional material. I can give you some questions on documentation and community and on licensing and maybe on build systems. So, you know, there's not a whole lot of things to test you on. Make sure you have these references downloaded. You don't necessarily, like I said, you don't necessarily need to read through them and memorize them, but you should glance through them, see how they're organized, and be able to use them to do different kinds of cool stuff that I might ask you on your test. All right. Knocked everything off my desk. When we talk about documentation, there are two parts that go into it. And we want to talk about both of those today. One is, why are we doing it? I am not a big one for just writing documentation for documentation's sake. I have spent enough time writing documentation for government specifications. I once spent 6 or 8 weeks of my life going through and documenting every function that was called in a delivery to the federal government because the people who had done it, who had actually written the code, hadn't followed the guidelines, and it wasn't going to be accepted, which meant that the company wasn't going to get paid. So I spent weeks going through every function in the system, one file at a time, looking at the API, looking at the inputs and outputs, and filling out an endless stream of boxes that said, you know, call one, calling arguments, list the calling arguments, types, purpose, API stuff. And it was boring as anything. It didn't do anybody any good because anybody who actually wanted to look at it, this was the federal government, they got the code, they got the source code. It was essentially open source, at least to them, from their standpoint. It didn't actually do anybody any good because the documentation lagged any changes put into the system. It was completely useless, except we wanted to get paid. And in order to get paid, we had to meet the letter of the contract, and the letter of the contract said, you will have a document that does all of this. So for thousands and thousands of lines in 6 to 8 weeks of my life, I made sure we were going to get paid by doing absolutely the worst possible thing in the world. That's useless documentation. There was no purpose. I mean, there was a purpose. The purpose was to get paid. There was no purpose for the documentation itself, except they wanted to, there was the thought that it would be useful. And as you developed it, you realized more and more that it wouldn't be. We're going to talk about documentation that has a different purpose. And when we talk about that, we're going to want to make sure that that the documentation we provide actually solves that purpose. And most of the time, we're going to want that documentation to be open source as well. Because the truth was that as I'm generating all of this documentation on an existing project that's being actively worked on, it is rapidly becoming obsolete, right? So what we want to do is we want to make it so that our documentation lives, grows, and changes along with the code base itself. So there has to be two things. There has to be a purpose to our documentation. Documentation with no purpose will wither away and die with any luck. And then we need to have tools that allow us to maintain that documentation. And the tools need to facilitate the concept that the documentation has to serve a purpose, and to serve that purpose, it has to be something that can actually live and grow along with the software. I'm going to try putting my camera on for a little while. Let's see if this dies. I feel like I'm not talking to anybody. This makes me feel at least like you guys are out there and can make some kind of connection with this little image. I don't know. Okay, so that was an awful long introduction to what's really a pretty benign section. There's a couple of things we want to be able to communicate. As we're developing something, right, we need to communicate our vision. What is this thing intended to do? Not only what are we doing right now, but what is it intended to do in the future, right? What is our vision for how this thing should be, a year from now or 3 weeks from now, whatever our time period is, we need to communicate that. And that's generally a high level thing, right? A design overview, something where you're just laying out, use cases. A user walks into a room, sits down at their terminal, brings up our program, and what do they do? What are their interactions with the system? What capabilities does the system provide them? Right? So that's kind of a high level view of the document. The other one is, so that's at the top level, communicating our vision to somebody else or back to ourselves, right? If you've ever had this beautiful idea for a project and then it was so crystal clear in your mind and you knew what you wanted to do, and then you kind of put it aside and 3 months later you come back and it's like, man, I had some really cool ideas. So documentation is for, either the next generation, us, or for external people to document what it is we're trying. Maybe the next level down is that of a module. And if you've done Python, right, you can, you know all about this high level module type of thing. The idea here is that when I do something, and I was going to try to bring up Pillow, but I don't think I have it installed in my Ubuntu environment, so I'm not going to be able to necessarily do that. But it's like asking help on a Python module, right? It'll tell you when you look at your module itself, right? What is that module for? The image module in Python, Pillow in Pillow is used to display and manipulate images, and it lays that out in some kind of detail so that you know what that specific file is going to do. Maybe you know what functions are part of the API in that module. Maybe you know any constants like the math. Here we go. That ought to work. Right, we can get help on the module. It tells us it's a built-in module. It gives us a description. Right, that way we know, is this a module that's going to help us or not? And we know it right in the code itself. And that's the important thing from the standpoint of enabling the growth of the community, is we want to be able to see what's there. We want it to kind of live and grow with us. Another level down, right, we have help on things like the documentation for a function method class, right? A lot of this we could see in the math module itself, right? The API for each call within it. But if we go down in and we start looking at the code, we'll be able to see, well, here's where they did a funky Fourier series to approximate pi or something. So just the stuff that will let us know when we're trying to actually modify or debug or understand the code. And those go along with like the embedded comments. Let's kind of flow down. Give a broad level documentation. This should be written for a general audience, somebody who may or may not want to use our function, right? A nice high level design overview. What does this do? How are we going to put it together for future developers? What's our philosophy, etc. After that, we're going to divide our project up into modules, and each module should kind of have the same description, but more on a module level. Documentation for function, class methods, and embedded comments. The important thing here, as I've kind of trying to be stressed, and I really like the Python system for this reason, is that our documents should be long-lived. And long-lived means they need to reside as close to the code as possible. And more than that, you shouldn't need special tools to deal with them. So if you've used Microsoft Word or a docx file, and you've ever tried to use that on a system that didn't have a specific reader for docx format, it's incomprehensible. HTML is slightly better unless you have something with a lot of embedded front matter. But when you get down to actually dealing with something that you want to live next to your code, you want something that's kind of free from all of these kind of constraints. So you'll see that in this class we use a lot of restructured text documentation. We use a lot of Markdown documentation. I kind of stick to Markdown unless I'm trying to write something in LaTeX, in which case I might use restructured text because Sphinx can convert between the two. The concept here is make it as easy as possible for the next person or for future you to read the documentation. Stay away from proprietary formats. Stay away from binary formats, things that can't be read natively. One of the beauties of things like restructured text and Markdown is we can look at the raw file on GitHub, for example, and it looks like this, and that's readable, right? That is just text on a screen. You kind of lose some of the highlighting and stuff like that, but this is absolutely readable, even if you don't have a restructured text or Markdown reader. This is Markdown, by the way. But also, we can go to GitHub, and GitHub knows how to render it. So it comes up in a nice format with all of our little links and our GitLab from a week ago, 4 days ago, etc. Okay, so that's kind of an important consideration. Documentation should live as close to the code as possible. I really, on projects that I deal with, I really like to see the code actually in the repository, along the documentation in the repository alongside the code. There's no real reason not to. And it should, in a lot of cases, even when you don't have separate directories for it, if you look at something like well, I'll pull this up later. If you look at something like vtk.org or itk.org, they actually use like docx to embed all of their documentation within their source files, or at least all of the documentation from module level down within their source files, just like you do in Python. And they can run, you can see the documentation right within the file, but they can also build a manual out of it by running a Doxygen engine on it. And it's really important to do this. I would normally be asking you guys why. If anybody wants to jump in, you are welcome. But I'm just going to keep talking. The why is, well, if you have the code and you don't have the documentation, right? If you don't know what the code's trying to do, will you even try it, right? If you just have something that says file.exe, there's really no way to find out what it does other than taking the chance and running it and try to scope it out. Documentation is only useful if it's associated with the code. And code is, so in order to do that, we want to make sure that the code and the documents live together. If your code's in GitHub, if your code's in Git, let's not even go to GitHub. If your code's in Git, why not put your documentation in Git? And why not find tools that work well with Git so that it's easy for people who make pull requests on your code to make pull requests on your documentation as well. Let's get all of those eyes out there, trying to make sure that your documentation stays up to date as well as your code. It's very important, ease of maintenance, right? You need to be able to maintain your code. You need to be able to maintain your documentation. You need to be able to use it easily. If you have to jump through a lot of hoops, one of the projects that I used to work on, ITK, you'll hear me refer to this a lot, actually went through and had this concept of the ITK journal. So in order to get your code, in order to expand the open source environment, what you actually had to do was you had to write a scholarly paper on how your code was structured, what it accomplished, all of the API stuff, and you had to publish it in this open journal called the Insight Journal. And then if it got enough upvotes, it would be brought into the code base. And it was a wonderful idea, wonderful concept, but in the end, it wasn't all that useful because of this. It wasn't easy to use, right? Getting something into the system required a really large investment in documentation, and then you had to put it out into the system where it may or may not ever get reviewed. And the hurdle was just, the barrier was so high that it was not an effective way of actually managing code and documentation for that particular open source, which is, by the way, the open source community is still going strong, but I think they've jettisoned the Insight Journal at this point. Entry-level people. It's easy to tell people to read the code. And eventually, everybody has to read the code. But it's not bad to have some signposts along the way, particularly for people who are either new to the technology or new to your particular project. When you're a distributed community, I'm not going to go down the hallway and knock on your door and say, hey, can you explain this to me? A lot of open source communities are distributed. Git was written because there was no effective way to communicate among the distributed community that was making up the Linux Foundation, for example. So, the right documentation, the correct documentation that serves a purpose is an important way of communicating with others. Sometimes this is as informal as a blog or an email an email group communicating. It doesn't have to be complicated, but you do need to be able to, a Discord channel, right? We use that all the time in this class. And here we go. Code may vanish, documentation remain. Well, or the other way around. Documentation may vanish, code may remain. If you keep them together, then they're always together, right? If you have a whole bunch of documentation for code and you don't have the code, well, you have a nice little storybook. If you have a whole big massive code but absolutely no documentation, and maybe somebody wrote it as part of an obfuscate C challenge, again, you can probe it, you can run it, but you can't make full use of the system. So it's important to have both of them, and it's important to tie them together so that they stay together. And it's important to make it easy to use, because quite honestly, if it's hard to change the documentation, if you need to jump through hoops, people are going to ignore it. If you make it easy to change the documentation, as easy as making a change to the code base or easier, then people have more incentive or less disincentive to keep it up to date. I talked about some of these. I talked about Discord and email lists and such, but there's a lot of different ways to communicate, a lot of different pieces of documentation that may or may not serve a purpose for your project. And again, these are all project specific as to whether they serve a purpose or whether they're needed. Wikis are cool. We're moving on Arcos. We're moving to a wiki-based format. If Steve is out there, he will be happy to hear that I'm actually publishing that part. Those of you who are in Arcos know that that's probably been a long time coming. There's blogs, as a developer, write a narrative of what you guys are trying to accomplish. It is kind of cool getting blogs. I subscribe to a couple of blog chains. So every now and then, Mozilla or Red Hat will send me a little blog on, this is where we are and this is why we're doing it and stuff like that. And those are really effective ways of reaching a non-technical audience, keeping them abreast of the high level stuff that you're doing in your project. You're probably not going to put the programming details down in there. And quite honestly, the wiki can live exactly with as we'll see in our lab this week, the wiki can live with the code. Blogs tend to be separate sites and tend to be a sporadic, kind of endeavor. And then you have things like user's manual. If your user needs a manual, well, one, you've probably designed your program wrong, but make it something that's available from within the program or that lives with the program, so that they're never, if you need a user's manual, chances are that they're going to lose the manual. So the manual should live with the project. I do a lot of home repair, mainly because I live in a house that's now 20 years old. So we don't have any of the manuals for any of the machines anymore. I have to go find them on the internet. It would be really nice if somewhere along with my dishwasher, the manual was kind of built in so I didn't have to find wiring diagrams elsewhere. That may be a little bit hard in that instance, but you can see when we're doing a software appliance, there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case. And then, of course, there are the ubiquitous README files. You'll see a lot of README files scattered throughout our course. Generally, they're just a couple of lines explaining what the directory is or what we're trying to accomplish there. They're real nice ways of getting guidelines or key posts or mileposts, guideposts or key information, just to say what's in that directory or what's in that specific place that you should be looking for.